One of the most important things we all need to understand about conflict is that it's natural. Conflict will happen. So anytime you even have two people in a room together, eventually, even if they're the best of friends, conflict will surface. So we need to understand that not to get alarmed whether we're dealing with an office situation with a student or in an office situation with an employee, another coworker, or in a classroom situation, right? Conflict will, in fact, happen because it's a part of life. So let's go over 9 rules for managing conflict at work. Rule number 1, recognize, as we said earlier, that conflict will happen. We looked at all kinds of studies, and basically 85% of employees have to deal with conflict to some degree. So think about that. If 85% of employees are dealing with it, it happens, and it happens frequently. According to statistics in the United States, it's always happening or it's frequently happening. So not only do we have conflict, but 36% of employees are reporting that it's always there or it's frequently occurring. At Lawson State specifically, we can look at conflict in that we deal with conflict in some regard every semester, whether it's student on student conflict, whether it's faculty on student conflict or student on faculty conflict, right? Whether it's in an office, a student in the office personnel, or maybe office to office employees, or even faculty to faculty employees or faculty administration employees, right? So it comes and surfaces in all different ways. The key is understanding that it is normal. It does happen. Notice that causes can be personality driven, 49% are personality driven. Also, heavy workload. So even the fact that we're all dealing with stress, notice that the more stress we have, 34%, as stress-related conflicts. So that means that typically, if you think about it, where conflicts occur when we look at students, oftentimes it's happening at the end of the semester, right? When grades are about to be due, and the stress load of that can actually create more conflict in the minds of students, right? So we need to kind of think about that. Also, our employees are under stress. Our faculty and staff have heavy workloads. There's a lot going on, and it can be stressful, and that actually can impact stress and dealing with stress, right? Number 2, this is a really important rule. Don't wait for an explosion to occur before you handle a conflict. A lot of times what we need to understand is that if you really get a student one-on-one or another employee one-on-one and talk about what's going on, but actually addressing the conflict early on, it's so much better. So it is essential to deal with conflict before it escalates and affects productivity or happiness in the workplace. So obviously, if you have 2 employees working in the same office and they don't get along and there are issues that it needs to be addressed, absolutely, because it can, in fact, affect productivity and happiness in the workplace. So it does have negative effects. So even though we said earlier that it's a part of everyday living, conflict, addressing it or not addressing it really is never a good option. Notice at the bottom here it says, if you sense a conflict brewing, address it right away. Don't wait to clean up after the explosion. In dealing with students in the classroom, I call explosions when a student has a conflict with you as the instructor and it's not managed, it's not dealt with, or maybe they've reached out via email or phoning and there's no communication back. That's rare, but it does happen. An explosion could simply mean that the student goes off in class, or they go out in the hallway and they end up in someone else's office. I know that some teachers have experienced students walking out of a classroom crying. Those are sort of what we call explosive kinds of situations. It doesn't mean that the teacher did something wrong, so I want to make sure that's clear, but we have a situation here that there's some type of breakdown in types of communication. And I'm just talking about normal. I'm not talking about a student who may be having some issues psychologically. I'm just talking about the average student who may end up in someone else's office talking about a problem that they're having in the classroom. So we want to try to address their concerns and really pay attention to when a student reaches out, because oftentimes it could be as simple as an email. So your ability to respond right back and say, hey, let's talk after class, or if you see a student in class giving you sort of odd body language, they look frustrated, they look concerned, don't ignore it, address it with that student, because sometimes it may not be articulated, so you didn't even know there was a problem. But if you look at their body language closely, you can usually pick up that there's something going on. Know your issue. Here is tip number 3. You and your company only have a finite amount of time, and I'm reading this, and energy. Take time to evaluate whether or not the particular issue is worth the conflict, or if you can just let it go. I love this because I use it. There are some times that you may have a conflict, but you deem it as, you know what, this is really not even worth dealing with. That means it might be viewed as very small, and you just kind of let it go. This is important. I always call this picking your battles. I often talk to faculty members about this. Think about your classroom rules and really think about which ones are really, really important and which ones are like, that may not be as important. And the reason why I bring that up is that sometimes rules themselves can create conflict. For example, if you have a rule that you must be in the class within 5 minutes of the start of the classroom or my door is locked. That rarely goes on our campus. Thank you so much, faculty. Our faculty usually don't do that. But let's just look at that rule as an example. Now remember, let's say we have many of our students who do not have private transportation, and we only have one dormitory. So if you think about the 5-minute rule, what if there's a student who takes the bus coming to school and there's a transfer involved, and they're taking the earliest route here to get here. They're supposed to get here by 7:40 every morning, but the bus is late, and we know Birmingham is notorious for that. So if you think about it, that 5-minute rule, right, that is not truly one that we would say, hey, that makes a lot of sense given our student population. The reason why it's helpful here, because if you think about it, that is something that you really could just let go. It doesn't mean that you don't have rules in your class. You could still give a quiz at the beginning of the beginning of the class time, and you go with that direction if you're worried about timeliness of your students. But there's other things you can do so you don't have or create conflicts. So you don't want to have rules in place that really pit yourself against your students, as my mentor years ago told me. That's how you can kind of measure whether a rule is really good. The same is true in offices, right? You can have rules in place within your offices, and rules and policies, they're not so much rules as they are policies. Maybe it's a matter of, you have to withdraw by a certain date. You have to do certain things. And you might be thinking, well, how would that create conflict? It creates conflict if we're not communicating it to students properly, right? So getting posters up and using email and the website to avoid those types of conflicts. So again, pick your battles and make sure that everyone understands and agrees with your policies and classroom rules. Foster flexibility and compromise. This is so important. When you're actually dealing with a conflict is best resolved, and you'll come out looking the best if both parties are willing to compromise and find a win-win situation. So if you are having a conflict with a student, whether it's in an office or in the classroom, you do need to listen. Please listen to what the situation is. Work out a compromise. It doesn't mean that you're always going to agree with the student, but try to find a compromise. Try to find a compromise. For example, here's a really good one, I believe. Let's say that you're teaching an English class, or maybe you're teaching a air conditioning and refrigeration class, and there's a project that's due. And you say that the project is due at 1 o'clock when class starts. Well, we have Blackboard, right? We have Blackboard. So let's say the student has an emergency, they can't get there, but they did their project. Why not allow that student to submit that project electronically through Blackboard? Again, I know that many of you are doing this, but these are the kinds of things that you do to compromise and work out and be flexible enough with students to avoid conflict. Because think about that. My car won't start, and it's legitimate. My car is not starting. I have my document in hand. It's on my computer. And so the more that you can show genuine concern and flexibility for students, the better. Or for that matter, your coworkers. That's important as well. So everything that we're talking about right now in terms of conflict, please understand we're talking about students as well as coworkers. Here's one of my favorites, right? It's a lesson for all of us to learn. I've had to learn it over the years. Keep it professional, not personal. In the workplace, it's especially important to keep conflict professional and courteous. Use polite, business-like language and objective viewpoint. Avoid aggressive phrasing and blaming. This is a human condition, so we kind of have to fight, our instincts to say, hey, wait a minute, it wasn't me, it was you, right? Hopefully we don't do that very often. But I always it's important in conflicts to self-reflect. Anyone who's ever worked with me or anyone else, hopefully at Lawson, they've asked you, self-reflect on the situation to see if there's anything that you can do to improve the situation. But remember, it's not personal. Now, sometimes it could be though. But even if it's personal, that means to say that someone doesn't like you. My goodness, eventually you're going to find someone who doesn't like you, right? So even in that situation, try not to take that personal. They have a right not to like you, in other words, right? But they don't have a right to disrespect you in the workplace or not be professional towards you. And that doesn't also give you the right, because you know they don't like you or there's an issue, for you to be unprofessional. So you just have to try to be professional. The other thing I'll say, and it's not on this sheet, is this. Hopefully we have you have more harmony with employees that you work together with, or maybe there's a student out there that, you have harmony with most of your students, but you might have the occasional student in your mind who doesn't like you. But remember, we work for the institution, so they are paying us to be professional. I'll steal that from Mr. Darren Allen. They are paying us to be professional, right? So just kind of think about that. And I love this part. When you're not professional, it does reflect poorly on you, right? So this is something we all, including me, we all have to work on maintaining our professionalism as much as possible. And here's the other thing that I would recommend that you do. Let's say you have a conflict, and it's a true conflict. You have tried to resolve it over the years, but you know what? You and this other employee, you just don't get along. You're like oil and vinegar. That actually can happen in a workplace. But what you want to try to do is minimize that. So, be polite, but you don't have to interact with that person 24/7. That's not the expectation. Just be polite. If you need to keep your distance from that individual, that is acceptable as well, unless you actually have to work together, and that becomes difficult. So if you actually have to work with that person every day in an office, then you're going to have to work with your supervisor to try to minimize anything that could basically minimize conflict in the best way possible. And just talk to your supervisor, because if it continues and you're unproductive, it could be a matter of asking for a transfer. Who knows? I hope it doesn't come to that, but there are situations like that that can be resolved. You need to work it out first and then talk to your supervisor. Okay, use your ears. One of the best ways to keep a calm head and an open mind during a conflict is to utilize active listening. Now, this I do want to comment on, because Mr. Allen and I do handle most of the conflicts on campus in terms of employee related, as well as Janice McGee and HR. So here's the thing. This is just an observation. Here's the one area where I think we need to work as a team better. That means that I've noticed, for example, and this is hard and I get it, if a faculty member is having an issue with a student and the student comes in to complain, students oftentimes, not to stereotype them, but oftentimes they're very emotional in these kinds of settings. And it's very hard, here's our little faculty member, to really listen to that. It would be hard for anyone, to listen to it. But what we have to do is practice listening. Even when it's hard for us, and even when we don't agree at all with what is being said. But it's important to basically, you can disagree with what someone is saying, but you cannot then say to them, your feelings mean nothing. They're not valid. That's when there's an issue. So an individual's feelings cannot be challenged. You can challenge, other things, accuracy, your intent as an instructor, or your intent as an employee working in a particular office. It was not my intent to offend you. It was not my intent to be short with you, right? But if it's perceived in that way, that's the reality for that person. So there's two different things that you have to kind of think about. So here are some tips. Restate the other person's viewpoint in your own words. And these are really good things that you can do. Check to make sure you are both on the same page. when you do that, it creates a feeling of respect and cooperation. Okay, so here's a good thing to say. You know what? I heard that you said that I disrespected you when I said to you